the table. How much you reckon that costs you to buy in Sparky's? Is that the name of the store? Sparty's. We want to do a nice station identification for Angelica's store. So Sparty's. How much a bottle of water costs like that?
I'm not sure, maybe $1.99.
Okay, $2 now. That's about a third of a liter, so that's $6 a liter. Here we're giving you pure H2O, 3,000 of those bottles for 50 cents. Think about that. That's cheap enough that you can grow certain crops like avocados and flowers on the high end using desaled water, okay? It's unbelievable, okay? And this is where the money was saved. You can look at this. The operation and maintenance has come down. Mostly it's in the energy. Used to be it's still high energy, but not like it used to be, and the initial capital, okay? So in 2002, the Israeli government decides we better start thinking about this thing, and they make the decision to make 4 desal plants. They said at the time 250, now it's been such a success for up to 510 million cubic meters of water. That's about 50% of the natural rainfall. Okay, we've increased it, and about 100% of the water coming out of people's taps is water that 2 days earlier was running around the Mediterranean as salt water, okay? So it's a real challenge there. There's nothing new about it, and I always have to do a space in the great Israeli tradition of shameless self-promotion. My university, Ben Gurion University, I have to say something about our founding prime minister, David Ben Gurion, who years ago in 1956 said, the purification of seawater by an inexpensive process is not only vital for Israel, it is a necessity for the world. Hundreds of millions of inhabitants of the great continent in which we live suffer from lack of food, yet only a small part of the Earth's surface is tilled. The irrigation desert with purified seawater will appear a dream to many, but less than any other country should Israel be afraid of dreams. And he sounds almost prophetic in retrospect on this particular issue. So this is how it looks, okay? We have a series of these going down, okay? And we're already moving forward with new plants, expanding them, and this map has changed everything, okay? It's also created certain kinds of security risks, which I'll talk about otherwise. So basically what it means, it's the end of Hydra Socialism. Because 3 years ago, we were at the peak of a drought. Not one drop of water was taken out of the Sea of Galilee, the Kinneret Lake, and brought down south. That's done. The water comes from the center of the country, both from wastewater reuse, most of the people live in the center, and from desal. It's a real sea change, sorry for the pun, in the way we look at this kind of things. And there are other environmental benefits. We get the scale, so if the water that comes through is softer, and it means that you can get better water supply, and it's better than the bottled water that we get, and the like. So there's all kinds of environmental benefits of using these. I will say, one story that's actually talk about unintended consequences. There was, when the first plant came online in Ashkelon, they used up the water for the local towns, Beersheba, Ashkelon, it even came to our campus, and they had a whole lot left over. It was a surfeit, so to speak. And they said, what are we going to do with the water? And they said, you know what? Let's give it to the farmers. All these years, the farmers have been using this very saline, kind of fossil old water. We're going to give them fresh H2O straight from the Ashkelon desal plant, and they did. And they said, they're going to love us. We're giving them champagne. I mean, this is the greatest thing. And they started irrigating their crops, and it was a disaster. The plants were dying. They said, but it's pure H2O. And what they found out is that what happens is that natural water has certain minerals in it which are critical, like calcium, like zinc, things that you need to have for plants. And when you have pure H2O, they're missing these, and the plants didn't have the basic minerals. So they had to go back and start talking about what is the minerals we want to put back after we made pure H2O, and that's what they've done. And it was a disaster for the farmers, but 4 of us got to get an article in Science, which is always good for an academic, so we thought it wasn't such a bad deal after all about this. But there are, I don't want to talk about desal as if it's a total panacea, because there are some concerns about, for example, the anti-scalants. I said that you push water through a membrane, those membranes can get clogged up. So to stop them from being clogged up, you have these things that are called anti-scalants, and they can really be collected in the brine and discharged, and there's some concern that they might cause some problem with what we call eutrophication, where there's loss of oxygen, and there's a concern that some of these chemicals are being discharged to the sea. In Israel, we're monitoring it closely. We haven't seen real problems left. You can see here the first published research on this issue, that there is 1.4 kilometers from the coast where we take all the brine and send it back to the ocean, which should be fine. But we do see that there is higher concentrations of salinity and some of these chemicals. But that's just in a small 300 to 400 meter radius. Outside of that, No problem. I can see that Danielle's skeptical, as she should be. She's our marine biologist. But all the same, it's a work in progress. It's a question, okay? Now, one of the concerns about desalination is it's going to take beach space. Israel only has about 200 kilometers of beach space. It is the most important open space resource in terms of recreation. And what happened is they took all the existing infrastructure. This is the Hadera power plant, and they said, we're going to fit inside that, take the area which is already lost. Nobody's going to go on the beach here. I mean, it's, you know, you're not allowed in because it's a security site. And so that's where they put these, literally inside all these existing infrastructures. So we haven't lost any beach space to lose from. So this is the master plan that we're looking at now, that it's going to continue to grow and have more and more and more. So in terms of where we are now, the interesting thing was last year was a rainy year relative to the past. And so the Israel said, well, it's expensive to desal. We're only going to use 70%. And when they heard about that in Jordan, they said, are you mad? Desalinize, give us, we'll buy it. It was the first time ever that they said they were going to do that. So this is what it's costing now. I don't know if this is of great interest to you. The bottom line is this. When we take a look at the downside of desalinization, this is the upside, excuse me. Here we've got our friend Borak here. So we've got contiguous to existing coastal infrastructure. We're not losing beach space. That's the good news that we would have been concerned about. The marine discharges, so far we have no reason to believe that there's going to be an ecological disaster in the Mediterranean Sea because of this. Now again, Israel's just one country. You saw the points. The cumulative impact could be greater. But right now, based on the evidence we have, there's no reason for real concern. And one of the advantages of desalination increases the amount of water dramatically. And when Israel's getting into negotiations with its neighbors, the hydrohysteria, which informed so much of the previous discussions about water, it's going to be about war. You say, no, you don't go over war. What is it? What is the cost of desalination? We said it's 50 cents for 1,000 liters. The entire area that Israel, the water resource that Israel and the Palestinians fight over is 300 million cubic meters of water. For 50 cents, $150 million. Now compare that to the cost of an F-15 fighter jet. You don't go to war over $150 million. So having this ability to produce water will allow us, I hope, to be more dispassionate. But there's downsides in here. We'll see what Simon has to say about the water. First of all, it still is a energy-intensive process. More efficient than it used to be. But unlike Australia, which had the good sense to link its new desal program with renewable energies, Israel never made that nexus. So we are increasing, like a typical desal plant produces electricity or demands electricity comparable to a city of 55,000 people. How many people live in East Lansing? Something like that, okay? So well, you guys have your heating bills, so that's maybe more here, but basically 55,000 people in Israel. So that's not an insignificant amount. It's not a huge amount, but it is a huge amount if we think that we want to be reducing our carbon footprint on this planet, and we need to do more about that, okay? There hasn't been there. It makes Israel more vulnerable, okay? And it's no secret that in its various and sundry skirmishes with the Gaza Strip, the Hamas militias are targeting our water infrastructure. And when you have 4 or 5 desal plants, which are all above ground, which are providing 100% of your drinking water, a few well-trained rockets, and they get better and better each round, might take out your drinking water supply. And then we got a real problem, okay? So and then some people would argue that it's wasteful, that it perpetuates a supply-side mentality. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that now, because the 4th stage in the Israeli water management evolution involves demand management. Up until now, we've been talking about expanding supply, right? Bringing water from the north, adding more sewage, making water from the sea. But at some point, we want to reach a balance, and we want to start, it's like a traffic congestion. You build more roads, they just get traffic jammed, okay? So what we want to do is think about ways maybe we can reduce demand. And actually, Israel's done some interesting stuff here as well. The first big thing we did was invent drip irrigation, okay? Drip irrigation, we've been irrigating in this land for years, first with ancient water systems, and now this was in the 1950s where we had massive sprinklers, and it was clear that in a dryland country like Israel, we can't bring back these areas without irrigation. But this gentleman here, Chaim Blas, who was a very, very, how to put it, he was sort of a mean-spirited, impatient, brilliant engineer who ran Israel's water infrastructure for the first 10 years. When he finally quit slamming the door, saying he couldn't deal with bureaucrats anymore. He put his time into inventing what he thought would be a way to deal with, a more efficient way to do irrigation. And what allowed him to do it, think again, we're in the late 1950s here, is the invention of plastic as a common material. And all of a sudden we can have this there, and makes it possible. He goes to a very poor kibbutz, Kibbutz Chatzerim, and he says, how would you like to go into with business? And they said, it sounds like a stupid idea. We got nothing to lose, and now Kibbutz Chatzerim are all millionaires because they've got kibbutz, they're $750 million in sales last year. I think they'll do better this year. They're doing very, very well. If you go, you'll find drip irrigation everywhere, from marijuana growers in California to orange groves in Florida. And when Israel had to vote what's our best invention, we said it was that. So it really does improve your yields dramatically because you are getting water directly to the source of your root zone, and you can bring in the precise amount of fertilizers you want to do there as well. It can reduce the irrigation, which is such a bad part of the traditional old flood irrigation. It reduces the evaporation when you're using wastewater. You don't want the wastewater flowing around, so it gives it right down there. You know, it's got this whole list that you can do it on steep landscapes. It eliminates the drift I mentioned, allows for precise chemigation. It splices, it dices. It's a terrific product, okay? So that's something to think about there that we've done there. Another area where Israel's been very, very, I would say, conscientious is trying to stop the leaks in municipal systems, okay? One of the crazy things in the Middle East is that everybody's short on water, and yet we are leaking away a third to half the water in the region. Okay, I heard before the war, Damascus, 70% of the water that was coming through the pipes never made it to where it was going, and yet there was a water shortage in the countries. Okay, Israeli cities lose less than 10%. We've 33% is the average in the West Bank. 42%. Here's a picture from Bethlehem, which I took off the web, which is being lost. That's what they claim. People who I say work in it's probably more than like 50%. So Israel's developed some technologies where we use thermal photography and different ways to identify the leaks, and we provide good public policy where you reward municipalities that reduce their leaks down below 5% and give them all kinds of infrastructure benefits, and you fine cities that are going over 10%, and it seems to work, if not rocket science, okay? But still, there's not enough water. Look at this as the Sea of Galilee, the Kinneret. This was the water level over the years, when the red line is the area below which you never ever want to go because it could allow for salinity, some salty springs to be allowed to come in and ruin the water quality. And yet the water was going down because they were pumping it on the national water, and they stopped pumping the water, and it's still going down because we had multiple drought years. So Israel decided to do something. Take a look at what happened. This is a chart what happened in 2009. And if you can look at this, take a look at 2009 is the purple one, as opposed to the previous years. And you can see that in the month of June and the month of the summer, the amount of water used was far lower than had been in previous years. Can you guys see that? Purple being the more recent ones. Somehow or other, they got domestic users of water to reduce water. And I want to just sort of explain why this is remarkable. There's sort of an axiom in water economics which says that water is an inelastic resource. If you think back to your macroeconomics, and James Madison, I'm sure everybody's had to take it at least once. But inelastic resources, you raise the price, doesn't matter. People are going to still do it, okay? And water is supposed to be an inelastic resource. I mean, I'm a father of 3 daughters. I could yell up there, girls, the Kinneret is going empty. And they'll still take a 15-minute shower because that's what it is. The water bill cost me a fortune. No, they take their shower because that's what all the economists will tell you. And yet, if you take a look at that, it looks like something's happening here, okay? Did they raise the price? Here's the chart. You can see the same thing, the numbers. Well, what happened was that they decided that they wanted to ban certain things in terms of washing cars and doing lawns or whatever. And the mayors of the cities went to the Supreme Court. Israel has a fairly robust democracy and a very activist court. And they said, you can't do that. They say, why not? They said, because look at all the water the farmers get. It's unfair for us to have to dry up the city gardens and the parks. And they said it's an arbitrary and capricious policy, and the Supreme Court shot down the regulations. So the water commissioner was in a bind. What's he going to do? He had to appeal to the public to cut back on their water system, okay? So how did he do this? Well, he had a fairly unique, I said Israel innovated. Here's an interesting water policy, or at least intervention. So for those guys who are in the things, you may know this woman. Her name is Refaeli. She's Israel's first supermodel to make it to the cover of the Sports Illustrated swimsuit edition. She was also the woman who was asked to run the water conservation campaign, where she asked Israelis to cut back on the water. And every Israeli male from the age of 15 to 35 said, okay, I won't shower for a month if Bar Refaeli's asking me. And I think that had more to do with the change in the water consumption. Okay, so let's go up to 2015 and start wrapping up and see where we are. So here we are, hoping that there'll be negotiations and that water won't be a source of conflict as it was in the past. Palestinians still have the reservations. They're not keen on desalination as some sort of a panacea, okay? And they have their arguments. They say we don't want to be dependent on the Mediterranean because that's, in effect, giving Israel control over our water resources. We think it's very expensive. We have more of a less high-tech agriculture, so we can't afford 50 cents a cubic meter. Desal plants can break down. We don't want to do that. And most of all, we should have the rights to the water where we live right now. So that's been their policy for a while. But in the Gaza Strip, which is right on the water, it is ineluctable for there not to be water there eventually. And the EU has been talking about doing this. And one of the tragedies of these periodic wars where the Hamas starts shooting at Israel and then Israel shoots back is that these critical infrastructure projects have not gone forward and the water supply is not clean. And desalination, which makes so much sense in Gaza, is going to happen. It needs to be happening. It's easier said than done to make a desal plant. They have to expand their electricity supply dramatically. They need a stronger water supply system, and the present cost is $800 million. Now, if you compare it to the costs that they put into the building tunnels and military infrastructure, it's not a lot of money, but it hasn't happened yet, okay? Here's an update which happened last year, less than a year ago in the World Bank. This is the Jordanian Minister of Water, the guy I told you about that was doing group therapy at 10 o'clock at night. And this is Shaddad Attili, who is the water minister. He's since been unceremoniously replaced. And our Minister of Regional Cooperation. They signed the first water agreement in the region in more than a decade, okay? Didn't make that big headlines. But the deal goes like this. In the very south of the country, in Jordan, they're going to make a 80 million cubic meter desal plant and give half the water to Jordan, to Israel. Taking that, it's unusual. It's sort of, you wouldn't think that, okay? And some of the brine will be sent up to help the Dead Sea, which I said is in such a deficit, okay? And Israel will transfer water back in the north so that Amman will get more water. This is how it looks. Israel takes water from the Kinneret, sends it up to the hills in Amman, and yet they get the same amount of water back there. So it's sort of a quid pro quo, and they made sure that the Palestinians were supposed to get a little bit of increase in theirs, and then the water, the brine from will go up to the Dead Sea, okay? So it sounds like a great deal, and everybody was, of course, the politicians said, we've solved the problem of the Dead Sea, we solved the problem of the water. But I wrote an article in the Huffington Post and said, no, you didn't, because here's the problem. The problem is 80 cubic meters of water is only 10% of Jordanian water supply. Now take a look at the population numbers. From 2.2 million to 6.5 million, their population grew somewhere on the order of 200%, okay? And if you want to use the metaphor, they are running to stay in place. They're on the treadmill. So that 10% may help them get through the next 2 or 3 years because, like I said, there's a lot of new people that need water in Jordan. So that 80 million cubic meters of water will not go very far. There is an intense attempt to get Israeli technology and training to Jordanians, and classes are being offered with them to encourage them to do this, and that's because we need to have desalination if we want to save our waters. This is a picture from the Jordan River. This is an organization called the Friends of the Earth Middle East. It's the only Israeli, Jordanian, Palestinian NGO with offices in Bethlehem for the Palestinians, Amman in Jordan, and in Tel Aviv for Israel. I'm delighted to be on the board of this fine organization, and they decided they can't wait for peace anymore. They've got to convene mayors from the area, and they brought them all together. They had the big jump, and they went into the Jordan River and said, we can do it together if we can find the water for this, okay? There's a peace park, which is now right on the confluence of the Yarmouk in Jordan, and about a month ago, finally this was declared as a protected park by the Jordanians, and we hope that this is going to happen. So my message is this. There is a debate about whether or not water is a source of war and scarcity, whether technology can solve it. Now I'll come out with full disclosure and come out of class. I'm basically a Malthusian, but in the area of water, I think there's ample basis to believe the technology can solve a lot of our problems, certainly in our troubled region. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm very happy to answer any and all questions. I should have assigned questions to the students, then I wouldn't have to worry about it. No, but really, hopefully, I've been sufficiently provocative to elicit a few questions. Anybody have a? We'll start with Michael.
Wasn't the condition of the Jordanian-Israeli peace treaty 20-some years ago that Israel would supply a certain amount, minimum amount, to Jordan? What was the basis of that at the time, and what is it continuing?
Israel at the time said they would. The question was, in the original peace treaty between King Hussein, the late King Hussein, the late Yitzhak Rabin, 1993, I believe, there was water, was one of the largest single section of it, and there was a Israeli commitment to transfer a certain amount of water. I think at the time it was 20 million cubic meters of water to Jordan. And Israel complied with that. Even during drought years, it was a hard thing to do, but it was part of the deal. Now, there's an interesting story about this. Academics and professors of water law write long and thoughtful articles about how do you define water rights and this kind of stuff. And they make all these calculations and equations. But the numbers, apparently the people who are negotiating were totally arbitrary. And how do we know they're arbitrary? Because we know what happened a few years later. In the year 1997, the Mossad tried to assassinate Khalid Mashal, who was the head of the Hamas political wing, was living at the time in Amman. And they botched the job. And the two guys who were carrying Canadian passports, although they weren't really Canadian, got caught by his bodyguards and got turned away. And King Hussein was irate. How could you possibly, we have a peace treaty and you're trying to take out people I've given a haven to? He was just furious. Israel was very embarrassed, and this was a huge strategic resource that was in trouble. So they sent the Minister of Infrastructure at the time was a guy named Ariel Sharon, who later became a prime minister. And he was a war hero, and he said it was a young, inexperienced Netanyahu back in those days, was still prime minister. And he said, see if you can work out this situation. So he flew in an airplane, an emergency flight. He was the Minister of Infrastructure in charge of water, and he went to meet the king. And the king had smoke coming out of his ear. He was so furious that you would try to assassinate somebody who Jordan is giving home to. And Sharon said, listen, you have two of our boys. I'm not going to deny it. You have them in your jails. And I want you to let me take them home on my airplane. And there's two reasons why. I got this from the top Israeli correspondent, political correspondent. So I think it's Nachum Barnea. I believe it's true. And he said, here's two reasons why. The first reason why is I'm a very fat man. I'm going to sit on those guys for blowing the job the whole way home. They're going to suffer like they never suffered. But here's the other reason. I'm going to give you 20 million cubic meters of water forever, in addition to what we gave you in the treaty. And King Hussein said, okay. Okay? Yes, there's all kinds of principles, but water trumps everything. So and Israel, I think, does give that and has a good record. What has changed is the willingness of Jordan to buy water. Up until now, it's always been about rights. Now they're so desperate. They'll say, we'll buy anything you'll desalinize, we'll buy. We'll pay market rates for it. There was a question in the back there, I think?
Yeah, so you mentioned that the development of these reservoirs to basically store the excess wastewater. Is there any re-injection into the aquifers going on? And if not, why not?
There is in the largest single sewage treatment facility for the greater Tel Aviv area. It's about a third of Israel's sewage. After they do primary treatment, secondary, and tertiary, then it is pumped to a field, a sandy aquifer, and it sits there for about a month or 2 months. There's a psychological problem all over the world with drinking recycled sewage. And I think we can all understand why, okay? The only place I think that actually does it is Colorado. So think about that. On the one hand, they got marijuana, but on the other hand, they're drinking sewage. So it's a hard call. But there's an area around Denver which actually has people drinking that. But once it's been in the aquifer for 2-3 months, hey, it's gone back to Mother Earth. And so people are able to, even though it's the exact same sewage, it's effluent, highly treated effluent, even though it may have some of those nasty EDCs in them. But so there is a bit of that, but it's only with a minority, and we should do it more. You're right. It's just another layer of cleaning up. And in fact, the water that comes out has less of those EDC chemicals than it does when it goes in. By it's probably parts per billion, but it's smaller, so it does filter out some of those. Yes, please.
Okay, so for like the desalinization plants, the salt goes back into the sea, and right now you said it's not posing any issues, but is that going to be sustainable in the long run? Are there any backup plans?
I don't think anybody has a backup plan. Everybody kind of hopes it's going to be okay. And this is one of the, like I said, environmentalists, they pay us to worry. And that's one of the things. I think Israel's water management situation is largely a success story. And as an Israeli citizen, I'm proud of it. It's been innovation. It's scientists working together with policymakers. We've been doing okay. But it is still an experiment. Nobody's done this before. And we know that there have been other experiments in the Middle East. Let's take the drip irrigation, okay? Well, there was for many years a civilization in Mesopotamia, about 2,000 years ago,